Now, a lot of different cultures have stories about this ancient world that exists underneath the ground, a world, an ancient civilization that comes from the time long before humans. And many cultures in the Americas, indigenous cultures, tell about this world underground where the sun never rises and never sets. Of course, the Scandinavian people told about the dwarves who still exist today, they said, and people would encounter the dwarves. And you might have heard some of those stories from books of legends and myths. You might have heard them in the old Washington Irving story, Rip Van Winkle, about Rip Van Winkle going into the mountain and meeting those gnomes. But the story that I'm going to tell you about that ancient underground world, it's a true story. It was told to me as a true story by a man who told me that he encountered that world and experienced it, as unbelievable as that might sound. Now, I heard this story on my first trip to the small town of San Juan Coatzospam. This is a small mountain town, a coffee farming town in the mountains deep in the southeast of Mexico in the state of Oaxaca. I went there in 2006 for the first time, and I went there looking for stories. I went there because my friends who are from that town, this is a Mixtec indigenous town. My friends are Mixtec, they're from Coatzospam. I met them in northern Mexico, and they told me, you should come visit our town. And they told me all kinds of fantastic stories, stories of haunted places, places where you would see ghosts, where you would see the duendes, the little people, stories of animals, strange animals that science hadn't even discovered yet. And they told me to go to their town, and they said I would encounter these things. So I went. I took a trip for the first time, 2006, deep into the mountains, went to their town. I met up with their uncle, and he allowed me to stay with him. Don Adan. Adan is his name. And most people in town spoke some Spanish in addition to their own native Mixtec language, so I could talk to people. And the first week, I spent a lot of time asking people if they knew any stories about strange things happening in town, paranormal things, supernatural things. And that whole first week, I was coming up dry. Nothing. Nobody had any strange paranormal stories. And I would ask them, I would speak in Spanish with the people in town, and I'd ask everyone, and they all came back with the exact same response. They said, no, nothing strange happens here. This isn't that kind of place. Strange things don't happen here. Paranormal things don't happen here. This is just a normal town. So I was starting to think that my friends had maybe just been taking me for a ride. Maybe they made up all these stories that they told me about these mystical things happening in Coatzospam. And I was starting to get discouraged. And then the second week that I was in that town, I was sitting with Don Adan in his adobe kitchen with the open fire. We were heating up a pot of coffee, and we were sitting around just sipping coffee. And out of nowhere, Don Adan told me, you know, I have a neighbor up the road here, Don Sixto. Sixto's his name. And he went inside the mountain one time. And I said, what do you mean? He went into a cave? He walked into a tunnel? Don Adan said, no, he just appeared inside the mountain. You'll have to ask Sixto. He can tell you the whole story. So I tracked Don Sixto down. I went there with a friend who could help me translate into Mixtec for some of the questions. And we went to Don Sixto's house. It was a small aluminum house perched up on the mountainside. And we sat down, and the summer rains were coming down outside, the smell of all that fresh vegetation. And Don Sixto told me this story. He told me that when he was younger, many years ago, that he was walking in the mountains. He was out looking for fruit. He was out in the mountains, and he stepped on a thorn. Now, he was just wearing some thin huarache sandals, so that thorn punctured his foot. It was deep in his foot. So he fell down on his side on the ground, and he was just in agony from this thorn in his foot. And then he looked up, and there was this strange man standing there. He'd never seen this man before. But the man spoke to him in his own native Mixtec language. And the man said, he said, there's no problem. I can help you. Speaking in Mixtec, and Sixto is thinking, who is this guy? Coatzospam is a small town. I've never seen this guy around. And so he said, yes, please, I'm in pain. Like, help me out. And so the man said, okay. He knelt down next to Sixto, and he said, I'll help you. You just need to close your eyes, and I'll take the thorn out. And so Sixto closed his eyes, And he felt the man pull the thorn out of his foot. And then he opened his eyes again. And when he opened his eyes, he was inside the mountain. He said he was in a huge hollow cave inside the mountain. And there were torches burning all along the walls of this massive cave, like arched ceilings, like a cathedral. And it was all illuminated and lit up. And there were just hundreds of people inside this cave. And the man who had pulled the thorn out was there next to Don Sixto, still speaking to him in Mixtec and telling him, Don Sixto, welcome to my kingdom. This is my kingdom. This is my city. These are my people. And that was when Don Sixto realized where he was. He was in the ancient world, the ancient underground world of those people from long before the Catholic Church ever came to Mexico. From those before times, they told stories of this world, and he knew who this man was. This man was el dueño del cerro, el señor del cerro, the lord of the mountain. He was the mountain king. And every mountain has its lord, its king, who's in charge of looking after nature and the natural resources there and the creatures. And they say that the mountain lord lives inside the mountain, and Don Sixto, he was face to face with the mountain lord, el dueño. And so the mountain lord told Don Sixto, you know what, come walk around, you can have a look. And he showed him a special chamber where they had musical instruments that Sixto had never seen before in his life. And there was music playing. It was a dance. It was a party. People were eating food. They were laughing. They were dancing. Sixto said they were all very tall, very beautiful people. They looked like they could be ordinary Oaxacan people, but they were much taller. Everyone seemed very tall and fit. And the man showed him the instruments. He said, if you touch one of these instruments, you'll know how to play it from now on. But Don Sixto, he was afraid. He was afraid to touch them. The man showed him to a library with books and scrolls and parchment. He said, if you touch one of these books, you'll know everything that's inside that book. But Don Sixto, he was still afraid. And so the mountain lord showed him around, and he invited him to dance with his own daughters. He invited Sixto to meet his 3 daughters, and Sixto danced with them to this happy, jovial music, a different kind of music than he had ever heard before in his life. When the more time he spent down there, the more he was becoming afraid, because this was something so unusual and so different from anything he'd experienced. And he was starting to freak out, to be honest. He was really getting scared down there. He got more scared when he looked toward the entrance to this cave. There was a big arched entrance, and next to the entrance, there were 2 huge pythons curled up on either side. And he asked the mountain lord. The mountain lord said, oh, don't worry about them. They're my guard dogs. Those are my guard dogs. They do my bidding. You're okay, Sixto. And he said, Sixto, if you want, you can stay down here with us. You can marry one of my daughters if you want. You could live here with us, the mountain people. But Sixto, he was terrified of losing everything that he knew. Back up on the above ground, up where the sun rises and sets, that's what he's used to. And so Sixto, he eventually said, excuse me, I need to go look for a bathroom. And he went down into one of the tunnels in this cave, and he could hear the music distant, muted. And he went down that tunnel, and he crossed himself, because he was a devout Catholic Christian. He crossed himself, and he said, Dios mío, ¿cómo llegué hasta aquí? My Lord God, how did I get into this place? And as soon as he remembered the now religion and the spirituality of this modern time, and as soon as he crossed himself, he was out of that cave. He was back above ground. He was back in that orange grove where he had been walking, sitting on the ground in the exact same space. Now, when Sixto told me this story, the first thing I thought, as a Westerner, as a person who thinks in these scientific ways in the culture that I was grown up with, my first thought was, oh, he must have had a hallucination. Maybe he fell and hit his head. Maybe it was all a dream, because he woke up in the same place. But the thing is, when he went back to town, he walked back to Coatzacoalcos, and everybody had been looking for him. They were all worried sick, his wife, his family, because he had been gone for 2 weeks. For him, it had just been an hour that passed, but for everyone in town, 2 weeks had passed and he had been gone. Very similar to that old Rip Van Winkle story, only not quite as exaggerated a span of time. But I spoke with other people in Coatzacoalcos, And they confirmed. They said, okay, we don't know exactly where Don Sixto went, but we know he was gone for 2 weeks. But he came back. He didn't look hungry. He didn't look thirsty. He came back in the same clothes. And to this day, Sixto swears to everyone that he went inside the mountain and he saw that ancient civilization, the ancient mountain people who live deep underground in that ancient world where the sun never rises and never sets. Thank you.